voting cloture tonight on a border security amendment that I know strengthens this bill, puts it in balance, creates trust with the American people, and creates the kind of pathway that many people are seeking. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Well,
Senator from Alabama.
The senator surely would acknowledge that his amendment was filed Friday noon, where probably 90% of our senators had left town, and it wasn't his 200-page amendment or just his interest. All kinds of special interests and senators' interests have been added to the bill, and it was filed as part of the overall bill. So you would acknowledge that the replacement that we would be voting cloture on tonight is 1,200 pages, to about a little less than 200 pages more than the bill was on Friday morning.
May I respond?
Yes.
Mr. President, in responding to the good senator with one of the best temperaments in the United States Senate, senator from Alabama, someone I enjoy working with, I would respond that there's no question that our amendment's 119 pages long and that it does incorporate input from other senators. And what I would say is the senator was a great jurist from the state of Alabama. He worked on all kinds of legal documents, I'm sure, before he came to serve in such a distinguished way in this body. And I know that he understands well, because I know he's had to do it many, many times, that when you have an amendment that touches many parts of a bill, or you have a contract that has changes that touch many parts of the contract, what people do to cause people to understand how it's written better, and actually it has to be a rule of construction here in the United States Senate, is you add those 119 pages throughout the text of a bill that's been around since May, that the senator from Alabama was able to go through in detail as a member of the Judiciary Committee and offer all kinds of amendments. He's seen that base text now for a long, long time and went through it almost more than most here, I know more than most here in the Senate. So yes, we added an amendment. It does have other concerns. That's what you do when you try to write a piece of legislation that solves a problem. It is 119 pages. It was added to the base text. That's true. And I would just have to say, on any measure, for somebody who cares about border security, it is much stronger than the base language.
Well, Mr. President, I'm going to talk about what the amendment does. And the senator hasn't seen quite as much, although he's an experienced and very able addition to this Senate, but hasn't perhaps seen how over decades promises about enforcement of the border don't occur, and that's important. Senator, I'll just go through the legislation, the amendment you've offered, and make some comments about why I think it does not do what you believe it does, and why we should not pass it, and why we absolutely should not move forward on the substitute, which is basically the bill that has been put out by the Gang of Eight, which fails in a whole host of ways. And I would just also be concerned, and will ask you, do you believe that senators who have concerns about the bill should be given the right to have amendments voted on in an up or down way as long as reasonably necessary to be able to offer amendments to fix the legislation?
Mr. President, I couldn't agree more with the senator from Alabama. And as I mentioned in my comments, I hope that this body, I hope that senators on my side of the aisle will not block Senator Rob Portman's amendment on E-Verify, which greatly strengthens the bill. But I agree with the senator. Yes, I hope we'll have a plethora of amendments offered this week, debated this week, and voted on this week. And I would just say to the good senator from Alabama, who I really cherish serving with, I have not blocked one single amendment from being voted on. I don't know if the senator from Alabama has blocked any, but the fact is, I say let's let it roll. I'd love to see another 50 or 80 amendments this week if time will allow. So let's let it roll. I'm all for that. I agree 100%.
I appreciate the senator saying that, but it's not going to happen. Because when you give cloture tonight, Senator Reid is going to be in complete control of the voting process. Amendments will be at his pleasure, the ones he thinks he's willing to vote on, and ones that he doesn't approve of, he won't be voting on. So I just would say that's where we are, and that's a fact, and we're going to have other cloture motions, and the goal will be to drive this bill to passage Friday, and we're not going to have before Friday, if possible, I suppose, and that's where we're heading, and it's going to be far less votes than last time a big immigration bill came up. It was 49 or so amendments voted on. We've done 9, and discussions were going on Wednesday, Thursday night to have another 16. And I was advocating more amendments be brought up, and I thought we had an agreement to do that. And we're moving that way till this great amendment, the grand amendment that fixes things, came up. Senator, let me just go on and point out a few things that I think are troubling with the legislation, and we can go on, Senator Corker, and just make my points now. First of all, you say there's a trigger, and that trigger is 10 years from now, and it's whether or not individuals who've been given legal status for 10 years have been told they're going to get their permanent legal status in 10 years, and it turns out that the Congress hadn't appropriated money to complete the fencing as promised. It turns out that Congress hadn't funded the Border Patrol agents that they promised, and now we're going to say, you don't get your status? And they're going to say, what's the problem? We did everything we were to do, and you, Congress, didn't do it. Give us our green card. And people are going to say, we can't deny the people the green card. If they've been here for 10 years, plus the time they've already been here, maybe have children that have been born and are citizens, this is not a practical guarantee that this will ever happen. It's not a realistic guarantee that it will ever happen. And I don't believe we're going to add, based on my experience, 20,000 agents. We probably don't need that many, but we need more, and we need a better effectiveness at the border. But that's the impact of the trigger. The legal status, the Social Security card, the right to work anywhere in America, is given within 2 months of the passage of the legislation. You're making promises 10 years down the road that I'm saying are not likely to ever happen. In fact, I don't think they will happen in the way you said. The Secretary has the power to reallocate personnel under this bill, and it gives her broad power to do that. And she'll say she's done what she's required, or the next Secretary will. And I'm concerned about that. On the cost, I've just got to say, and Senator Schumer and the Judiciary Committee, they promised that the bill was paid for by the fees, the punishment, the fines, and I'll talk about that at some length later, that will be paid by the people who enter the country illegally. And they claimed they would have as much as $8 billion. Maybe that was so. I'm not sure. They wouldn't tell how many people are going to be legalized. I asked that twice to Senator Schumer. He refused to say how many people would be given a green card status in the next 10 years in America. Maybe he didn't want us to know. If he didn't know, that's a big gap for somebody who's writing a 1,000-page bill and doesn't know how many people are going to be legalized in it. So this is what he said. What we're simply doing is making sure that all the expenses in the bill are fully funded by the income that the bill brings in. This is to make sure that this bill does not incur any cost on the taxpayers, to make it revenue neutral. And this is just a little point to me, but one I care about. He said it provides startup costs to implement the bill, quote, repaid by fees that come back later. So what we're basically doing is setting up 2 pots of money that have startup money, and it's repaid that both the companies pay when they get new workers and the immigrants who become RPI pay in terms of their fines as they go through the process. Well, that's what we were told in their talking points, in their poll-tested talking points when they were drafting the original version before Senator Corker was involved. But it's not there now. It's $46 billion. Where is the money coming from? Well, they say the bill creates more revenue. And this is what the Congressional Budget Office, our budget accounting firm, told us about it. It said before Senator Corker's bill raised the cost from $8 billion to $46 billion, that it would increase the on-budget debt by $14 billion. It would then reduce the off-budget debt by $211 billion or something like that. So isn't that good news? So we improve our off-budget debt. Well, what is the off-budget debt? The off-budget debt is the Social Security and Medicare withholding that the newly legalized persons will pay when they get their Social Security card. So they'll be paying withholding on their checks that maybe they weren't paying before. And they score that as increased revenue. And it certainly is. And in the one form of our accounting will show that as an increased revenue. And that money in that form of accounting, unified budget accounting, allows you to think you can spend it for anything you want to. But wait a minute. What is the real reality here? The person's paying their Social Security and their Medicare withholding, and it doesn't go to the U.S. Treasury. It goes to the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. It's not available simultaneously to be used to pay for a new bill. And this is how this country's been going broke. It's the same thing that happened during Obamacare. And I got Mr. Elmendorf the night before the vote, December 23rd. We voted on Christmas Eve to pass that bill. I got him to say you can't simultaneously strengthen Social Security and Medicare with this new money and pay for something else with it. He said, use this phrase, it's double counting the money. That's where they're coming up with the money here. So the Social Security and Medicare payroll withholding that people will pay when they get legalized and are given a Social Security card is their retirement. We got to have that money to pay for their retirement when they get ready to draw Medicare and Social Security. You can't spend it now and pretend we got free money. And it's clear in the CBO score just last week, that's what the situation is. I'm just not happy about this counting this form, the money in that form.
Drink of water. I wonder if the senator let me just respond in a generous way.
Senator from Tennessee.
First of all, I respect the leadership that Senator from Alabama has given on the Budget Committee, and I know that he knows all of these things well, and he's very familiar that I've offered actually a very detailed piece of legislation to deal with Medicare. And he knows that the average American today is paying 1/3 of the cost of Medicare over their lifetime. And in other words, they pay only 1/3 of the cost of their Medicare program. So the fact that you'd have people who began paying taxes, I mean, one of the things the senator's mentioning is you're right. We pass this bill, those who are here today that have been undocumented and not paying taxes will pay taxes. I would think the senator from Alabama would think that is an outstanding idea. And most of them are younger. And the fact is, what they're going to be doing is helping the baby boomers and senior population in America that we have, because Americans today are only paying 1/3 of the cost of Medicare. And you've seen, I know the senator from Maine is very knowledgeable on this, that the Medicare fund is going to be insolvent in 2024. So he's exactly right. By forcing these folks who are in the shadows today to come out of the shadows for 10 years and to pay taxes and not receive, by the way, federal benefits, no means-tested federal benefits, until we do the 5 things that are in our bill. By the way, the senator should know that the money for this is appropriated now. If this bill passes, the money's appropriated. It's not subject to appropriations down the road. But let me I'll say one last thing and I'll yield the floor. I know I'm being a little, I appreciate you letting me do this.
I want to make sure whose time was being used. But go ahead.
This is beyond Senator Leahy's time, as I understand. But let me just say this. The cloture vote tonight is not as was described a minute ago. The cloture vote tonight is only on this amendment. It's not on the bill. So for someone to say that they're losing some kind of cloture rights down the road, that's just not true. The cloture vote tonight we're having is on an amendment that has 5 strong border security measures that every Republican has talked about for years. It doesn't mean you vote for the bill. We're talking about the amendment. The monies are appropriated. The cloture vote is on the amendment only. So I just wanted to clear that up. And CBO, that the great senator from Alabama works with daily and quotes daily, the CBO has said that if this bill passes, it'll help tremendously with this deficit that we know is weighting our country down today.
Well, I thank the chair, but the cloture will be on the substitute, which is 1,200 pages, not just the senator's amendment, most of which I would be supportive of. I think maybe all of it, if we can make it effective, I would say that. And Senator, you're correct. People who are paying into Social Security and Medicare don't pay enough to produce the revenue that would take care of them for the rest of their life. And you're right, and I certainly don't dispute that people who, when they're given a Social Security card and start to work under this bill that provides them amnesty and legal status, that they're going to pay Social Security and Medicare money they weren't paying before. But it's their money. It's the money that's got to be used to pay for their retirement. Where's the money going to come to pay for that? That's all I'm saying to you. It's quite plain, and that's why the CBO score said the on-budget deficit gets worse, but in the 10-year window, the Social Security account looks better. But they are not counting that the younger, average age 35 workers will be retiring in the years to come and demanding their Medicare and Social Security. And the money, if it's spent now, won't be there then. This is how a country goes broke. And I want to say, Senator Corker is one of the most knowledgeable, hard-working, courageous, determined people in the United States Senate to try to fix the financial path we're on. But I think you're misinterpreting that issue. Well, let me just, I didn't want to use, how much time has been used on my side? And some others, I'm going to have to save some time for some other people that are due. Or how much have I used would be the question, maybe.
Senator has used 60 minutes.
60? Senator said he was using some of his time now, but...
$40 minutes.
All right, Mr. President, I better wrap up then because I know others want to speak on in opposition to the legislation. So, with regard to the fence, so there's a statement of the sponsors of the Corker-Hoeven amendment that we're going to have a bunch of new workers at the Border Patrol offices. That will be guaranteed. I pointed out how that's to be funded over 10 years. This is not an appropriations bill. It's a promise. The legality, the amnesty occurs first. And just like so often in the past, the promises never occur when competing interests start fighting over money. Just doesn't happen. And there are some people that have opposed fences and opposed Border Patrol agents religiously, using every excuse possible in this body. And it will not be easily accomplished in the future. And in fact, it will not be fully accomplished, in my opinion. Well, with regard to the promised fencing that there's in the bill, the new substitute requires the Secretary submit her southern border fencing strategy to Congress and certify that 700 miles of pedestrian, not double-layered reinforced fencing, as was required in 1988, that never happened, that then Senator Obama voted for, then Senator Biden voted for, then Senator Clinton voted for. Never happened. Only 36 miles of that ever got built because there was discretion given somewhere a little later, and all of a sudden they talked about a virtual fence that never occurred. So this weakens current law, or it weakens the law we passed previously, and the new bill says the second layer is to be built only if the Secretary deems it necessary or appropriate, close quote. That's what happened in 2008. The new bill keeps the language from the Gang of Eight bill addressing limitations on the requirements for strategy. And this was offered in Judiciary Committee by Senator Leahy. I was rather taken aback by it because they'd been promoting the bill as being a bill that had fencing in it. Senator Leahy offered the amendment. The Gang of Eight all supported those on the committee. It said this, quote, notwithstanding the requirement that the Secretary come up with a southern border fencing strategy, nothing in this subsection shall require the Secretary to install fencing or infrastructure that directly results from the installation of such fencing in a particular location along the border if the Secretary determines that the use of placement of such resources is not the most appropriate means to achieve and maintain effective control over the southern border at such location, close quote. So I think that is a fatal flaw in the language. It allows the senators to believe, perhaps, and advocate that their bill guarantees that we're going to have 700 miles of fencing when it's not there. It's not there. And Senator Leahy knew exactly what he was doing when he offered that amendment in committee. And the substitute, the 1,200-page substitute, includes this exact Leahy amendment language. It's not changed by the senator's offer of legislation. So, Mr. President, my time is, I've spoken more than I intended to. A number of other issues I would raise if we had the time. But I really believe that this is close to what we ought to be doing, but we don't have the mechanisms in place to get us there, and we can't count in any realistic way of this all happening. As a result, we're going to have, as we had before, the legalization now and a promise of enforcement in the future that does not occur. I thank the Chair, yield the floor, and reserve the balance of the time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I thank you, and I thank the gentleman from Alabama regarding his comments. I would rhetorically ask any of those who might share with the Senator's views, if you will, on this amendment, that would this amendment, I would just ask the question, I guess, would this amendment, if you don't like the status quo, would this amendment, even if it wasn't fully achieved, and I believe that, I know the language states that it has to be achieved before you achieve green card status. Okay, it was very specific in that regard. I would just say that do other senators not believe that if this amendment passes, we'd be much further down the road towards our goals than if this amendment doesn't pass? I would just ask rhetorically. What we do a lot of times on the floor, Mr. President, is we seek to improve a piece of legislation. And I know the senator from Alabama is not going to vote for this bill regardless of what the security measures are in all likelihood. But I would just ask if he and others who share his views, which are critical of this overall legislation, why would they not support an amendment that certainly is a vast improvement over the status quo. I think the senator has pointed out that it's very unlikely that Homeland Security is going to do the things that we'd all like for them to do. But in this amendment, we've got the five of the things that Republicans for years had hoped to achieve, and the administration clearly states that you cannot move from this temporary status into green card status until these are tangibly done. Again, much better than a trigger that has some superfluous thing that nobody knows what it means, and the Democrats are worried we're going to move the goalpost one direction, and Republicans are worried we're going to move the goalpost another direction. Instead, we've got something here that is very tangible. Every American that's observing will know whether we have 20,000 more Border Patrol agents deployed and trained first. Every American will know whether we have an exit-entrance visa program fully deployed. Every American, every employer for sure, throughout our country will know whether we have an E-Verify system that is fully deployed. Every American will know whether the additional 350 miles of fencing, which I would just say to the senator from Alabama, there is no chance in the world, no chance, that any additional border security measures are going to be created that way unless this amendment passes. And then I would say, think about the $4.5 billion in technology that will cause us to have situational awareness on the border that is a part of this bill. You know, again, Mr. President, Congress constantly talks about the fact that we punt too much to the executive branch. And I know that many people on my side of the aisle do not want to punt, if you will, the border security plan to the head of Homeland Security, whoever that might be. They want to weigh in. And so this amendment gives everyone in this body the ability to weigh in, but for the other side of the aisle to ensure that we've got tangible measures that cannot be moved. So, Mr. President, again, I realize that no matter what this bill says, no matter what it says, as long as the title of it relates to immigration reform, there are going to be people in this body that won't support it. There are measures, I don't want to get myself in trouble by stating the kind of measures that if they were in this bill, people would say, no, it's got to be even tougher, okay? The fact is that we in this body, generally speaking, have worked together to try to come up with a piece of legislation that meets the balance. This amendment, to me, adds that component that meets the balance. And I do appreciate it. I know some people on my side of the aisle would criticize because they would say, well, you worked with the other side of the aisle to make this happen. Mr. President, I think that's what we all came here to do. The President, I know who's an independent, I know came here to do it because without working with Republicans and Democrats, he couldn't get anything done. So what we've done over the last couple of weeks now is work very closely on both sides of the aisle to come up with a measure that hits that balance. It doesn't move the goalposts because we all know when it's tangible. As I mentioned, I used to build shopping centers all around the country, retail projects in 18 states, and you know, when I finished the project, you could see it. I didn't have to go out and get a survey in the community, well, did I meet 90% of the retailing needs of this community? And if it was a grocery center, they might have said, well, you did on the grocery side, but you didn't on the florist side or some other piece. I built something that was tangible and called for, and it was paid for. The reason we've had this trouble, let's face it, the reason we've had this trouble is we've been debating a trigger for months that everybody knows can be monkeyed with. If you see a Cheeto bag in a crevice someplace in Arizona or someplace, somebody could say, well, there were 10 people eating out of that Cheeto bag, so we're going to change the denominator. That's what this debate has been about, and everybody knows that. And so this side of the aisle doesn't trust this side because they're afraid we're going to add 10 more folks with that Cheeto bag, and we're going to change the denominator. And this side over here is saying, well, we don't trust it because we want to see results. Well, this amendment gives results. Gives results. Every American can see the results. Again, I cannot imagine how anybody on this side of the aisle that is serious about border security could want the text that's in the base bill that doesn't stipulate anything, stipulates nothing. I don't know how they could want the text that's in the base bill over the text that's in this amendment, which clearly lays out those 5 things we've discussed over and over again. 20,000 trained and deployed border agents, 350 miles additional fencing on top of the 350 that's there. Republicans have tried for years to get 700 miles. We add the $4.5 billion in technology that the chief of the Border Control area, Chief Fisher, who's been in our office, been in many people's offices for years. He's wanted this equipment to do what he needs to do, and it's in this bill. An entry-exit visa program. We have 40% overstays on our visa program. It's terrible, but it has to be fully deployed before, again, you move to the green card status. And then again, E-Verify, which, let's face it, why are people coming across the border? They're coming across the border to take care of their families. They want to work hard. That's what we want our kids to do. They're walking across the border to work hard, to do all kinds of things. They create companies and they're entrepreneurs, but they also raise our kids. They service meals. They bring our crops in. They build our homes. They build our buildings. They want to participate in the American dream. And what this bill, not our amendment, lays out is a path for them to be able to do that. It's a tough path. They get at the back of the line. They pay taxes for 10 years and receive no means-tested federal benefits. And somehow, we have people opposing that, even though these triggers have to be in place. Mr. President, all I can say is this is a great nation. This is a nation that has laws, and we're laying out the way those laws have to be in this amendment. I hope that people will look at this amendment for what it is. It's an opportunity for both sides of the aisle, to succeed, for Republicans to have those tough border control measures that people want. I was in a restaurant Saturday night in my neighborhood, a place that I go often. The place serves great hamburgers. And when I walked in, what did people say? They want border security. So we've got an amendment. We've got an amendment that puts in place, as Governor Brewer of Arizona has said, is a victory for Arizona. A victory for Arizona. On the other side of the aisle, what people have pushed for is a clear path. They want to know, no, we're not going to move. We're not going to wait 10 years and move the goalposts. Let's have tangible goals that people can see. So, Mr. President, I hope everybody will get behind this amendment. People on our side because of border control, people on both sides because it achieves the balance, if passed, that a piece of legislation like this ought to have. And I just want to say again, Mr. President, I have enjoyed working on this amendment and this piece of legislation over the last 10 days more than anything I've done in the United States Senate. We have an opportunity to do something great for this nation. Great for this nation. And the passage of the cloture vote this night on this amendment is something that takes us a step closer. Even if you oppose the bill, even if you oppose the underlying bill, those people that hear concerns from all around the country about border security should support this. This is better than in the base bill. So with that, Mr. President, again, I want to say 119-page amendment. People know that the way we write language is triple space, big letters. We've got a lot of seniors in this body. You know, we write in big letters, okay? The average page is really about 3 or 4 pages of language is the average page for most Americans in what they read on a daily basis. A middle school class person in Tennessee could read this amendment in 30 to 45 minutes. 30 to 45 minutes. It's been available for 75 hours. It has tangible goals that we've all sought for. Voting for cloture tonight does not end debate on the base bill. That is not true. It ends debate on this amendment. There's still cloture votes into the future that close off the cloture, the debate, if you will, for those people listening in, that close off debate on the overall bill. So nobody's given up rights. Why not strengthen the bill even if you oppose it? And if you're for the bill, why not vote for a measure that might add people to this piece of legislation and send it over to the House of Representatives? Well, they'll create their own bill, and there are improvements that they can make. Why not do that? Mr. President, I urge a yes vote tonight. I hope people will actually read this language and see what it does to the underlying bill. And I thank the President for his time this morning. Mr. President, also notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I request consent that the quorum be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd like to speak about the immigration bill, but first I want to make a comment about this international drama that is going on from Hong Kong to, well, I guess it started really in Hawaii, from Hawaii to Hong Kong, now Hong Kong to Moscow, and then the question is, where does the fugitive go from there? I think we ought to face facts that the government of China would not have let him go without making the decision with regard to Hong Kong. And I wouldn't have been surprised if they didn't get certain information from him if, in fact, he has anything. But the fact that he is now in Moscow and did not get on the airplane for Cuba tells me that the old KGB officer, now President of Russia, Putin, is directing the show. And I wouldn't be surprised if the President of Russia is not giving the orders to milk him for every piece of information that he has. And if he really doesn't have anything, then I think the President of Russia is going to decide whether or not he wants to have a good relationship with the United States and might allow him to be extradited to the U.S. So it may well be that since he was released from Hong Kong, which is really under the direction, in this case, of President Xi of China, that he may not have all the information that he's claiming to. Now, presumably he is carrying a bunch of laptops. Well, you would have thought that they would have taken that into custody, and maybe that's what's happening right now in Moscow. However it plays out, as I have said from the beginning, I think his behavior is treasonous behavior, and that the full extent of the law ought to be applied, and those countries that have a formal legal relationship with the United States ought to obey the law and have him extradited to the United States so he can face the charges. By virtue of his escapades all over the globe, I think it is clearly indicative that he does not want to face the full extent of the law. And I think all the more that would justify the Department of Justice in the charge that they've brought already on espionage. Now, Mr. President, I wanted to say a word or two about the immigration bill. Clearly, on the first day of the debate, I came out here and embraced it. Clearly, we need comprehensive immigration reform. When I was a young congressman back in the 80s, I voted for it then. The big difference back then was that we only had about 2 million illegal folks in the country. Now the new term is undocumented. Of course, that has swelled now to over 11 million undocumented. In large part, the law that was passed back in the 80s was never observed. Businesses did not obey the law, and that's one of the things that we're looking at in this comprehensive immigration package, that businesses will have to obey the law and still will be able to get the labor source that they need in order to conduct business. And that through a series of E-Verify and others, that they can then have the security of knowing that who they have hired is in legal status. I think it's clearly the right thing to do. 11 million people here. These folks that are saying, oh, well, deport them, that's not common sense. You can't deport 11 million people and the economy would collapse. Just look at the agricultural community. You have to have the source of labor to pick the crops when the crops are right, otherwise the whole crop is lost. And so, too, as you go through so many of the nuances of this bill, it's all put together, and I think they've done a good job. Now, I have one bone of contention. I came to the floor today absolutely shocked that the amendment that Senator Wicker, Republican of Mississippi, and I have offered it's questionable whether all this falderall that's going on about not accepting any additional amendments, whether or not it was going to be accepted. This amendment says that in addition to the land border security, which you've heard, that's the story for the last week, laboring over how do we increase border security. And the estimate on this new amendment that we're going to vote on today is it's costing an additional $20 to $46 billion. That'll really tighten up border security. But if you've made the land border almost foolproof, what do you think's going to happen? How are the smugglers going to get the illegals across? How are the smugglers going to continue to try to get across all the illegal drugs? Just like water if you dam it up in one place, it's going to try to go around. And where is going around? The maritime border. If you make the land border on the southern United States foolproof, where do you think the smugglers and the illegals are going to go? They're going to go to a very porous border that is from Texas to Louisiana to Mississippi to Alabama to my state of Florida, which has the longest coastline of the continental U.S., and then up the eastern seaboard, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, etc. And they're going to do it also by going in through some of the Caribbean islands, including a United States territory, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Because if they get there, then they're on U.S. territory. So if you're spending, now this is where the common sense comes in. If you are spending $46 billion additional to secure the land border, why wouldn't you want to spend an additional $1 billion to help secure the maritime border? California would be another one. You can come up the coast of Central America into California. It perhaps is a more daunting task because of the waters of the Pacific, but look at all the opportunities on the coast of a state like mine, of Florida, of bringing in smugglers. And of course, we've seen this over the years. So what do? What's the $1 billion for? Simple, real simple. We already have an unmanned aerial vehicle, like a drone, like we read about over in Afghanistan, a Predator or some version thereof, unarmed. Today, it's flying out of the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. But that's one. And when it's down for maintenance, there's zero. So why wouldn't you enhance one UAV with more stationed strategically around the coastal maritime coast to stop what is supposedly going to happen if this impregnable land border is there? Number two, the United States Navy is experimenting with a stable platform that is very cheap to operate called a blimp. I have flown in this blimp. You can station blimps with a long dwell time because the amount of fuel that is used in a blimp from start to finish for upwards of a 24-hour mission, if you had 2 crews on board, that amount of fuel is the same that it takes to crank up an F-16 just to get it out there on the runway. It's a huge cost savings, and it gives you a lot of dwell time. So why wouldn't you enhance for the United States Navy the blimp that is being tested for the 4th Fleet headquartered at Mayport Naval Station? You should. And thirdly, the United States Coast Guard. Why wouldn't you enhance the Coast Guard's ability to patrol not just for drugs, not just for some of those who are trying to come into the United States illegally now through the maritime border, but why wouldn't you enhance the Coast Guard? So for $20 billion extra to $46 billion for this amendment that we're going to vote on this afternoon, why wouldn't you add another $1 billion to stop the illegal immigration and drug smuggling that's going to occur on the maritime border. Just think about it. Just think, when you try to stop water from rushing forward and you put some kind of dam that stops it, if there is any break or leak or hole, where is that water going to go? It's going to go in the place of least resistance. So too, smuggling of illegals and drugs, if they can't get across the land border because of our friends insisting that it become impregnable, why would they want to block Senator Wicker's and my amendment that says we're going to enhance modestly, because we can handle it with overhead and on-the-sea assets through the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy? It's common sense. Common sense ought to rule. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have 3 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent these requests be agreed to and they be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm about to suggest the absent quorum, but I would ask consent upon the lifting of the quorum that I be recognized for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, would the Senator yield?
Yes, I'll withhold my request, of course.
The Senator, the esteemed chairman, who his leadership has brought us to this point that we are on the brink of passing a major immigration reform bill. And the Senator has heard my comments earlier. Doesn't it make common sense that if we're going to be making as secure as possible the land border, the southern land border of the United States for illegal immigration, which also includes drugs, by the way, would it not make sense that we would want to increase the maritime border security?
I'd answer to my friend from Florida, who has been a friend for decades and knows the coastal area far better than anyone else. The more secure you make the land border for those who want to have illegal entry into the United States, the more they're going to look for other ways. Water is one of them. The distinguished senator from Florida has seen everything from boat lifts on through coming into his state. Without naming the countries, we know them all. And so a long way around is saying, of course.
I thank the senator from the esteemed chairman of the Judiciary Committee. It is common sense. I appreciate him underscoring that, and I hope our brethren and sisters on the other side that are questioning whether or not they're going to allow Senator Wicker's and my amendment to be considered, I hope that they will reconsider their decisions.
Well, Mr. President, I would note that there are some in this body, I'm sure, who want no immigration bill. I get the feeling that's a smaller and smaller group. I imagine they would love to just keep killer amendments going for weeks and weeks and weeks, hoping the bill might die. On the other hand, there are some very legitimate requests made on both sides of the aisle. I've been told that some of the ones that might want to bring up that would pass probably unanimously, that the other side would not allow them to come up unless we allow all these other amendments. I would hope that during the next few days, both sides would allow the distinguished ranking member and myself to sit down and go through and accept, as you normally do in a bill like this, a package of amendments that are acceptable. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum with time be equally divided.
Without objection. Clerk will call the roll.
President, I suggest the calling of the roll be suspended.
Without objection.
I know that when I come to the floor and remind my colleagues about my involvement in the 1986 immigration bill, that it sounds like a broken record. I said early on this year that I wanted to educate my colleagues about the mistakes that we made in 1986 so those mistakes were not repeated in the first immigration bill to pass the Senate since 1986. Because I was here in 1986, I thought I could share the experience we had. I know firsthand that we screwed up in that 1986 legislation. I was certain that other members in this body could learn from our mistakes. However, today, we're right back to the same place, talking about the same problems, proposing the same solutions. In 1981, as a freshman member of the Senate, I joined the Judiciary Committee and was very active in the subcommittee process. We sat down and wrote the legislation. We had 100 hours of hearings and 300 witnesses before we marked up that bill May of '82. Hundreds more hours and dozens more hearings would take place before the bill actually became law in 1986. This year, we had 6 days of hearings. We spent 18 hours and 10 minutes listening to outside witnesses. The Judiciary Committee received the bipartisan bill at 2:24 a.m., April the 17th. We held hearings April the 19th, 22nd, and 23rd. We heard from 26 witnesses in those 3 days. We heard from the head of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency Union. We heard from economists and employers, law enforcement and lawyers, professors and advocacy groups. We even heard from people who are undocumented, proving that only in America would we allow somebody who has violated our laws, not right with the laws, to be heard by the American people. One of the witnesses on April 23rd was Secretary Napolitano. We attempted to learn about how the bill would affect the functions of the executive branch. After all, that's where it's going to be carried out. And whether she saw some flaws, and the same flaws, that many of us were finding in the legislation. We asked follow-up questions of the Secretary that were thoughtful and focused on mechanics of the legislation. We wanted to know the Secretary's thoughts since she'd be implementing the legislation. Unfortunately, we still have not received responses to questions that we raised. Today, it has been 2 months that the Secretary has failed to answer our questions. In a sense, ignoring us. She has refused to cooperate. She has refused to tell us how the bill would be implemented by our department. Now, isn't it amazing, at least it is to me, that the majority puts up with this, let alone some of our own Republican colleagues? After the committee hearings, we started the markup process on May the 9th. We held 5 all-day sessions where members were able to raise questions, voice concerns, and offer amendments. Common sense amendments offering real solutions were repeatedly rejected. Those that were accepted made some necessary improvements, but the core provisions of the bill remain the same yet to this very day. I respect the process that we had in committee. It was open, fair, and transparent, even though the end result was almost determined. We had a good discussion, debate on how to improve the bill. It was a productive conversation focused on getting immigration reform right for the long term, not to make the same mistakes we did in 1986. Yet I was disappointed that alliances were made that actually ensured nothing passed in that committee process that would make substantial changes and improvements to the bill. Now, those alliances remain in effect when we're out here on the floor of the United States Senate. As of this morning, 349 amendments have been filed to the underlying bill. We started off the debate on the Senate floor with my amendment that would require the border to be effectively controlled for 6 months before the Secretary could process applications for registered provisional immigrant status, RPI, or in another way of saying it, legalizing those who have crossed the border without papers. Now, that's pretty darn important, because we've been told since this bill was put to the public by the Gang of Eight that we were going to secure the border. Well, we're going to secure the border after legalization, because a plan put before Congress is not securing the border. Securing the border is only if that plan actually secures the border. But legalization is going to take place before any plan's put into effect. And that's what I consider a major shortcoming of this legislation, because it makes the same mistakes we did in 1986. We thought we secured the border. We didn't secure the border, but we legalized. Now, my amendment was surely feared by the other side because it would fundamentally change the bill. It wouldn't fundamentally change what the authors of the bill said, that they were going to secure the border and then legalize. But it changed what was actually in the language of the bill. So, in order to keep my bill from being adopted, they insisted on a 60-vote threshold for the amendment to pass, which I refused. So in response, they moved to table my amendment. Now, we were promised an open and fair process. Why wasn't that promise kept? We learned on day one that all the talk about making the bill better was just hogwash. It was a phony and empty promise. They'd take to the floor and they'd say that they were ready to move and vote on amendments. Boy, that sounds very fair and open, doesn't it? Yet, in reality, they were afraid of all the amendments that could be offered. They refused to let members offer any amendment of their own choosing. They wanted to pick what amendments would be considered on the floor of the Senate. Does that sound fair and open? Well, it obviously doesn't. They wanted to decide who, what, when, and how it would be disposed of. That's not right. What's even more disturbing is the fact that the alliances made thwarted the ability of the minority to have any say whatsoever. Republicans were obstructed even by members of our own party. They voted to table amendments. They refused to open the amendment process. One Republican said, quote, "I am confident that an open and transparent process, one that engages every senator and the American people, will make it even better. I believe this kind of open debate is critical in helping the American people understand what's in the bill, what it means for you, and what it means for our future." End of quote. Well, that quote was never carried out here on the floor of the United States Senate. That same senator also wrote Chairman Leahy on March the 30th saying, quote, "I write to express my strong belief that the success of any major legislation depends on acceptance and support of the American people. That support can only be earned through full and careful consideration of legislative language and an open process of amendments." End of quote of that senator's letter to Chairman Leahy, March 30th. Well intended, but I don't see a defense of that position out here in the floor of the United States Senate as we're steamrolled. In a letter to me on April the 5th, the senator wrote, quote, "If the majority does not follow regular order, you can expect that I will continue to defend the rights of every senator, myself included, to conduct this process in an open and detailed manner." Well, as we're being steamrolled with just a few amendments being considered, you can see that may have been well-intended, but it's not carried out. When the bill was introduced, the senior senator from New York said, quote, "One of the things we all agree with is that there ought to be an open process so that the people who don't agree can offer their amendments." End of quote. Well intended. The Gang of Eight called for a robust floor debate. They said they supported regular order. So I asked them, do they think that having only considered 9 amendments equates to a robust and open